Welcome back to Skilled, Safe, and Trailblazing. If you're responsible for training the next generation of lab professionals or looking to level up your own expertise, you're in the right place. My name is Jessica Martin, and I'm a lab training professional with a background in chemical education research and community empowerment. I'm here to dive with you into the real-world strategies, expert insights, and game-changing discussions that will help us develop lab professionals who are skilled, safe, and trailblazing. One of the most amazing things about a society supporting academic research is that it creates a space in which researchers can spend a lifetime developing and refining a concept that can prove to be useful to the rest of us. I'm going to spend this episode introducing you to the concept of safety climate as elucidated primarily by Professor Dov Zohar. So who is Professor Dov Zohar? After getting his doctorate in industrial organizational psychology back in 1975, he joined the faculty at the Israel Institute of Technology, where he would spend the next 40 years developing the concept of safety climate with both theoretical and applied research methodologies. I came across his research as a graduate student in a department of chemistry when I got more interested in examining lab safety education for researchers. I had hoped that one day I would get to meet him, but unfortunately he passed away in 2023. I've included a link in the show notes to an in memoriam page that the Israel Institute of Technology maintains for him, and I've also included a link in the show notes to his Google Scholar if you're interested in diving into the wide breadth of his research. Today, I'm going to talk about the bookends of that career. Links to the two papers and the book chapter that I'm going to discuss today are in the show notes. If you are unable to access them, send me a message on LinkedIn and I'll be happy to help. Zohar's first publication on safety climate happened way back in 1980. He was working on developing and validating a safety climate survey, and he pulled in a lot of different dimensions into this survey, and he worked with 20 different organizations within Israel that had high hazard work environments. And he used these folks to validate that survey and included interviews and observation of lots of different elements within those companies. If you want to see the detail of that, please do go to the paper. Now, what he found with his safety climate survey is that there were really 4 climate dimensions that grouped into 2 different groups that were real differentiators between companies. So that first grouping had to do with the perceived relevance of safety to job behavior. Okay, in this case, this was reflected by regarding safety training as an important prerequisite for successful performance, and also viewing higher work pace as potentially hazardous. And so that higher work pace, that's going to come up a lot in his research because it's something out there that a lot of people postulate to be a competitor in terms of working safely within an environment. The second grouping that he identified as a major differentiator among organizations was the perceived management attitude toward safety. Now, this can be readily exhibited in workers' eyes by the organizational status of both the safety officer and safety committee. In terms of the safety committee, they're looking at what level the participants are at within the organization and if they're actually actively participating, and then also the actual implementation of decisions, right? So do workers see any real changes happen as a result of that safety committee work? The second element to this, that safety officer, they're really looking at beyond observation, right? So a safety officer can observe something that may be higher risk or may identify a new hazard, but do they have the authority to do anything about it? So these two groupings, like I said, come out as those differentiators. Now, right away, it's really important to understand with the concept of safety climate, this isn't about the worker. This is about what the worker is perceiving within their environment. And it's one of the reasons why I think safety climate is such an important concept. When I started to get involved in safety, I entered an ongoing conversation about the concept of safety culture. And while there's a lot of discussion about getting away from just blaming the worker and actually looking at more of the elements in the system, what I find is so many people ultimately still end up blaming the worker. With safety climate, Zohar very intentionally took that step back. It really looks at things from the worker's perception. And I just feel like this is a much more realistic approach to safety, because what he's really asking, what he's really setting up for you, is looking at this worker walking into this environment and saying, okay, hi, I'm the worker. I want to be successful here. And I'm going to observe what's happening in my environment to figure out where to focus my energies, what to prioritize so that I am perceived as successful, so that I can get raises, I can get promotions, I can benefit in some way from this. And I find that so much more realistic than asking about people's moral stances or, questioning whether somebody's a good person or not. And what he is arguing here is that those companies that have fewer accidents, what the employee is perceiving from their environment is that safety is an important part of their jobs. It's an important part of being seen as a successful professional in this space. And they get that reinforced on multiple levels and in multiple ways, which is why even if the employee isn't the safety officer or isn't on the safety committee, it's important for them to see that other people are also benefiting from centering safety within their work. This also pulls in this phrase that is associated with Zohar a lot, and I certainly have peppered it through a lot of my writing and my speaking, and it is the idea that employees react to what gets supported and rewarded. Right? So if safety is an afterthought or something that ends up messing up the system, then you're probably going to get less support for it and less support from individual employees for it. But if they're seeing it get supported and get rewarded, then they're much more likely to embrace it as part of their professional identity. Now, after 30 years of continual and deeper research into this space, Zohar then published a paper in 2010 where he looked back at that 30 years, not just of his own research, but also of other safety climate scholars' research. And he reflected on what was going on in that space. He did say that a lot has been achieved in terms of validating safety climate as a robust leading indicator or predictor of safety outcomes across industries. But he said that now the time has come to actually move on to the next phase of scientific inquiry, in which these constructs are being augmented by testing its relationships with other components in the system. He specifically focuses on three different ideas, three different theoretical issues in this space. So first, by postulating that the targets of safety climate perceptions relate to system-level attributes, such as relative priorities of competing demands, espousal enactment gaps for discrepancies, or internal inconsistencies among policies and procedures, it becomes possible to differentiate safety climate from other perception-based constructs. Wow, what does that mean? It means that he really wants to see more of a focus on looking at how safety is actually interacting in the space amongst these different levels of management. When it comes to the relative priorities of competing demands, that is being determined by the hierarchy. There are managers above those frontline workers that are deciding what the priorities are, and that he postulates has an impact on safety climate. The second one, this espousal enactment gaps or discrepancies. So this idea that management is saying one thing, but what actually happens in the space is a different thing, right? And so when workers see this conflict, they are going to embrace what is actually enacted, because that's what they're experiencing on the day-to-day. Again, that's what's getting rewarded and supported. So you can't play the do as I say, not as I do game, because everybody is just going to do as you do, because they're seeing that as the way to get rewarded and supported. And then finally, this idea of internal consistencies among policies and procedures. This is a different take on that, as opposed to just the espousing one way but enacting a different way. This is also looking at different levels of management and asking if those are all aligned or if those are in conflict with each other. And so this can have really confusing impact on workers and how they approach their jobs. The second issue that he's looking at addressing is looking at how to separate out a worker's perception of the safety climate at different levels. And this goes into what I was mentioning earlier, that you have different levels of management, and the workers may be perceiving a type of safety climate within their own team versus what it looks like for the broader team. And so Zohar was arguing that, there's this practice of mixing items that are actually associated with divergent levels of analysis, and that further research really needs to clarify what level is being looked at, because they can then see more of the detail and more of the patterns in terms of what's going on with workers. The third issue is about developing these industry-specific climate scales. If you dig into the concept of safety climate, you're going to find that there are researchers out there developing safety climate scales for different industries. It's not that they're wildly divergent. A lot of the times when you line these things up, you're going to find a lot of commonalities, but it does allow the researcher to identify new context-dependent targets of climate perceptions in those respective industries, which can be really helpful in terms of how to operationalize ideas in different spaces so that we can address these issues. So you might be asking, why did this work resonate with me as a chemical researcher? I'll tell you. So I got an opportunity to work in a company in Germany for about 3 months while I was in graduate school. And when I entered that lab, I had never seen a cleaner, more organized lab in my life. It was pristine in there. And yet there was loads and loads of work going on. There were a lot of researchers in there sharing lots of equipment, and they had to figure out how to work around one another in order to keep the production going. This was a company, right? So they didn't have time to sit around and do nothing. They had to be doing things efficiently. What I observed there was that safety and even the very basic concept of housekeeping, it was part of your job. It was part of what actually made you a good professional in that space. I was only there for 3 months. It was a graduate student internship. And I got to tell you, I don't actually know who the safety officer was. And there was something that really stuck with me about that, because every other lab, I knew who the safety officer was. But in this case, I didn't know. It wasn't one person's job to make sure we were all functioning safely. It wasn't one person's job to go around cleaning up after people, right? It was everybody's job, and it was part of what made you a professional in that space. And I've really thought about that a lot because in all the other spaces I've been in, the messaging that I kept getting is that if you're a superstar, if you're highly productive, it means that your bench is a mess. It means that you leave messes all over the lab because you're so busy being amazing that you don't have time to clean up after yourself. And that's just a ridiculous messaging, right? There's another component to that as well. I do want to say I fully support teaching researchers how to do risk assessments on their experiments. And I think that researchers should get really good at that. But what I find very limiting in terms of how I see risk assessments done is that the risk assessment is done on the experiment that I, as the researcher, am going to perform, right? That makes sense to a degree. Except what that risk assessment does not take into consideration is what hazards already exist in my environment. And what hazards exist in my environment does depend on how the lab as a whole runs. If people don't clean up after themselves, if people aren't responsible, and this behavior of cleaning up after yourself and running things safely isn't rewarded and supported, then there's going to be all these hazards in my experiment that were not identified in the risk assessment. And oftentimes it is those things that either cause the safety incident or makes it so much worse. And so I think it's really important as we're spreading this idea of really getting researchers to work on developing more robust risk assessment skills, that we really have to talk about that environment that they're going to be bringing the experiment into, or else we're missing a huge part of the picture. And that ties into this concept of safety climate. It's not just about the individual researcher being safe. It's about the environment that they are bringing their work into. In 2014, Zohar wrote a chapter for a book where he outlines these ideas a bit more. He emphasized that safety climate items should refer to employee perceptions regarding the priority of safety, and that climate perceptions emerge out of a sense-making process in which employees try and identify the meaning or logics of action underlying the web of formal policies and informal practices and role expectations characterizing their place of work. Now, this really resonated for me because part of my graduate work, I was really investigating this idea and discussed at length how our policies and procedures conflicted with our everyday experience of working within labs. And so this conflict is very, very important to understand because employees are essentially trying to figure out what rules they're supposed to follow and what rules they can ignore. He goes on to say safety climate perceptions inform employees about the likelihood that safety behavior will be rewarded and supported under a variety of work conditions in which investments in employee safety compete with those associated with production and/or profit. Now, somebody may say, hey, we don't talk about profits within academia, but we do talk about papers. Okay, there is production. Those students are in there to do those experiments, to produce those papers, to ultimately write the thesis that they need to get out of the program, to get out of the program successfully. And so there is still this conflict between operating safely and high production. Now, he also outlines some antecedents that from his work he has observed are likely to promote the emergence of safety climate perceptions. And these are really the ideas that he was hoping to inspire other researchers in the field to continue to investigate so that we could strengthen the theoretical underpinning of the concept of safety climate. So those four issues, those four antecedents are, number one, structural attributes of the work environment. So they're really looking at the extent of that investment in employee protection. Number two, symbolic social interaction. So really looking at the social networks and the conversations being had amongst employees as they're figuring out that sense making and what they're basing that sense making on with one another. Number three, looking at group and organizational leadership. So this has to do with the exchange of information amongst people and their leaders and how they use those conversations to figure out that organizational environment. Again, figuring out what actually gets rewarded and supported. And then number four, psychological work ownership. This has to do with the idea of an individual worker really feeling a sense of ownership over their work and building the concept of safety into that. I'd love to hear from you all on this. Are you familiar with Zohar's development of the concept of safety climate? If not, what context have you heard of safety climate in? And are there any other researchers or theoretical concepts you'd like to hear discussed on future episodes of this podcast? And did any of the stories I shared here today resonate with you? Let me know by either emailing me at skilledsafeandtrailblazing@gmail.com, commenting in our LinkedIn community linked in the show notes, or if you are listening on Spotify, leaving a comment on this episode. Thank you for all you do to develop lab workers who are skilled, safe, and trailblazing.
Skilled, safe, and trailblazing is meant for those working in labs or training others to do so. The information shared here is a starting point, not a complete guide or legal standard. We've done our best to use reliable sources, but we make no guarantees about accuracy or completeness. Always follow local, state, and federal laws and consult legal or safety experts if you have questions.